And welcome back to Brock House, here on the campus of Pepperdine University in Malibu, California. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful dean of our Graduate School of Public Policy, and I'm excited to welcome you back here to part 2 of our 3-part series, What the Ancients Taught the Founders. Throughout this series, we're going to be exploring the relevance of the ancient examples of Athens, Rome, and Sparta, their thinkers, cultural examples, and examples of political philosophy, and how they interacted with the founders in the creation of our American Democratic Republic. Who better to go through this set of relationships than with our Giles O'Malley Distinguished Senior Fellow, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. Dr. Hanson, welcome back.
Thank you for having me again.
So in this session, what I wanted to explore was the connection in political philosophies, the philosophers, leaders of ancient Greece, Rome, Sparta, and the American founding. And I thought as a place to start, we might begin in a counterintuitive way to look at one of those Greek philosophers that actually wasn't followed much by the founders. It's probably the philosopher that most of us know when we think about the ancients. And that, of course, is the Greek philosopher Plato. In one of the readings that you've assigned for us, and just as a note to those who are watching, the links to the 3 readings that we have for this session will be found in your YouTube description. One is from the political scientist John Zvesper, in which he noted, and I quote, "When he, Plato, was studied and discussed as by John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, he was found to be a political visionary with little to contribute to this founding of an actual republic." Why was Plato, maybe the most famous of the Greek philosophers, dismissed by many of the founders?
I think there were 2 or 3 reasons. One, the most simplistic, is the genre in which he wrote. In other words, he was not a systematic philosopher like Aristotle that said, this is the politics. I'm going to talk about 4 types of democratic governments, 4 types of oligarchic, or I'm going to have the Constitution of Athens. He wasn't systematic. These were dialogues between Socrates and various philosophers, rhetoricians on particular topics like poetry, philosophy, rhetoric, but there was no systematic outline. And the 2 that were closer to that were, that is, the Republic, where he outlines a utopian type of government, or the Laws, where he has a codification. For the enlightened philosophers and statesmen in Europe during the Scottish or British or French Enlightenment, or the American Enlightenment, which was a precursor of the Constitution and the founders, he was, I guess we would say, more of a Hobbesian, a right-wing totalitarian. So if you look at where, for example, child raising should be collective, and the government should be run by guardians that were not elected, but genetically, or they didn't know about genes then, but in some fashion scientifically selected, philosopher king. And when you look at the laws, in Plato's laws, it directed every aspect of the citizen's life, even to the extent how close you could plant olive trees to the road. And to the founders, this was exactly too monarchical, too dictatorial. And they didn't, if you flip through Plato, where do you find a description of the advantages or problems with constitutional government? He doesn't think like that. It's more inspirational, they thought. And so the 41 basic dialogues and treatises, I think we have 15 or 16 of the so-called letters. Some of them may not be genuine. They're just not, they don't offer an enlightened political establishment models or even insights onto the advantages or disadvantages of consensual government. And then there's the final suspicion, and that is Socrates, for all of the modern efforts to rehabilitate, was a man of the right. And he was seen by the 30 tyrants in Athens as a kind of a godhead of the 30 that had a coup and took over at the end of the Peloponnesian War. They took over the government. And Plato himself said he left Athens later so that philosophy wouldn't be sinned against twice, meaning they killed his mentor, Socrates. The democracy did. So the democracy's popular court killed Socrates. Now, they said he introduced new gods and corrupted the youth, but the subtext of that was a right-wing cabal of sort of young Critias and these young zealots had been students of Socrates, and they felt that he had unduly influenced him in an anti-democratic fashion. And that death then also directly affected the late period of Plato. Usually people suggest that in the early period it's 80% Socrates, he's just right. Some of these early dialogues, and then the middle period of the longer dialogues is 50-50. But the late period, the Republic and the Laws, which you would, if you were a founder like Hamilton or Adams or Madison or Jefferson, those four were very familiar with Greek text, you would look for, you're going to get a very right-wing, that's not a good term, right-wing, but a very authoritarian, totalitarian view of what government should be like.
And just to follow that thread, we discussed in the first session how the founders' views of these ancient cities and philosophers actually changed over time.
Yes.
And that was specifically correlated to this view of, at first, the weakness of the Articles of Confederation and the necessary step found by the founders. And it was a debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. But the belief, which obviously became the winning argument, that there needed to be a stronger constitutionally organized central government. Is that the same kind of transition?
I think if they were aware of, say, Plato, the most common dialogue that they were aware of was Plato's Apology, or at least renditions of it in Plutarch's much later lives, where there's or better yet, Xenophon, references of people who were students of Socrates or Neoplatonists. And in those, in the Platonic corpus, there is a subtext that you do not want Athenian democracy. It's too radical. There's no blinkers, and the Laws and the Republic are maybe an overreaction to that democratic excess that led to the loss of the Peloponnesian War, the destruction of the Athenian Empire, the collapse of the walls of Athens are taken down, Socrates is executed, that whole chaotic reaction, that counter-revolution to the democracy was considered a testament to why democracy doesn't work. Plato favored that counter-revolution. There's one other thing that may or may not, and people have argued that the early church, since you don't find in the Acts of Paul or the four Gospels of the New Testament or Revelations, things like that, you don't really see a blueprint how to form a church. So early questions such as, well, if I give birth to a young baby and he dies before he's baptized, does he go to hell? There's really not a purgatory in there. What if you're not observant and you live a remarkable pagan life, but maybe you believed in the divinity of Christ, but not the rituals of the earth? What happens to you? Is there a limbo? Well, these early church fathers, from Augustine all the way to Aquinas, and later late Roman philosophers, the text that they found the most valuable to form the outline of a Christian dogma or doctrine was Plato, because he was the one philosopher that kept saying that there is a body and then there is a soul. And that famous metaphor where he said, well, your body disintegrates, does that mean your soul dies. No, it's like a song. And you have their version of a harp, a lyre. Just because you don't have a lyre, does that mean the Star Spangled Banner doesn't exist? Because you can't. It comes alive anytime it has a body, but when the body's not there, it's still there. And then he talked in the Republic sort of about a purgatory-like experience, and that there was a connection of how you lived in this transmigration of souls. And the paradigma were in the Republic, the mythover and all of that a person might have to keep dying and then coming back and getting a soul and then resisting the temptations of the corporal existence, and then finally the soul had reached a level where it would not be tempted, it was pure, and then it would end up in the Elysium, taking the pagan philosophy to the philosophy. So he was very influential in the church, and the line between Neoplatonism and Christian dogma and the original Plato thought had been blended. So a lot of the deists, the founders, were thinking, well, given how Plato was used in the late Empire to create the foundations of the Catholic Church, Christian at that time, and in the Middle Ages, he's not going to be as valuable to us in a way that Aristotle was just purely empirical.
Well, that's actually a perfect transition to my next question, and bringing up another statesman and philosopher, this time from Rome, because one statesman philosopher that the founders really did often cite was Cicero from Rome, and specifically his arguments around natural law and its connection to the founding of a republic that would support, defend, and be based on it. I wanted to read again from the political scientist John Zvesper this quotation and get your thoughts on it. Cicero's statement of natural law, a fragment preserved from his Republic, as right reason in agreement with nature, confirmed revolutionary Americans' view that this higher law justified their independence, and the idea of natural law continued to play a prominent part in the consciousness of America's framers and of their constitutions. So first, tell us a little bit about Cicero, because he wasn't just a philosopher, he was also a statesman and a leader. And then the importance of his writings around natural law and how that influenced the founders.
Well, he was probably the most influential Roman, except for Julius Caesar and maybe Augustus. He was born somewhere, I think, 107 BC. He was a member of the equestrian upper class. He lived outside 50 or 60 miles from Rome. And he was executed during the proscriptions of the second triumvirate. In other words, he thought he had a patron in Octavian who would become Augustus, who would protect him against the maniacal Mark Antony. But when Antony and Octavian had not fallen out yet, they would not fall out until the second round of the civil wars. And they each got names in this triumvirate, along with Lepidus, that they could kill. And supposedly Octavian said, you can't kill the great statesman. He was 67 at the time in 43. And he had been consul. He had written these philosophical works, emulating Plato. Plato's Republic became Cicero's De Republica. Plato's Laws became Cicero De Legibus. And in addition to that, he had been a military commander in Cilicia. He was given as a proconsul the province of Cilicia. It's the northern part of Asia Minor, over facing Cyprus, that area. And then in addition to that, he had been famous as a custodian of the Republic. In other words, he had gone after Catiline, who tried to overthrow it. He had found rampant corruption among the senatorial class, with Verres as a proconsul in Sicily. And he was the most prolific. I think we have about 55 of his speeches and philosophical works. He probably had about 85. In Petrarch, in the Renaissance rediscovered this massive trove of letters to Atticus, his friend. I mean, we have hundreds of them. So, and as part of that corpus, he created the Latin language as we knew it. Latin language was not really, until Cicero, it really didn't have the vocabulary or the syntax of the grammar in a way that would be accessible to discuss highly sophisticated argumentation or abstraction. But he was able to take abstraction and make it very clear. He's kind of the Asiatic style. In other words, he has long sentences. He's the one that when you're taking a graduate course in Latin, your professor will grade you A, B, C, D, E, based on the percentage of your Latin vocabulary that's found in Cicero. So if you use a word and Cicero never uses it, you can't use it. And Caesar, on the other hand, had beautiful style, but it was like a Hemingway. Like Caesar saw the enemy, period. Caesar advanced, where Cicero would have turned that into a long sentence with dependent clauses. But so he's very famous as the founder of classical Latin. He's the most prolific philosopher and rhetorician and orator in Rome. He's called the Roman Demosthenes. And he was a man of action. And he played at the end of his life very high stakes politics, because he did not know about the assassination of Caesar, but after it was over, he approved of it and championed Cassius and Brutus. He bet on the wrong horses. And after they lost to Anthony and Octavian fell out, and there was going to be another round. So then he threw his lot in with the adopted nephew of the dead Caesar, and it was kind of difficult because he had supported that.
Right.
But Octavian thought he was very valuable, and then he gave this series of they were brilliant, called the Philippics, and they copied Demosthenes' attack on Philip of Macedon. And so they were called Roman Philippics, but they are directed at Mark Antony. And they go through his gluttony, his alcoholism, his promiscuity. He's bumbling in the Senate. He doesn't know. It was just vicious. And he was assured that Octavian would protect him. And then they had this useful alliance for a while, where they said, wait a minute, let's ally ourselves against the Senate and the sons of Pompey, who was Sextus Pompey. And and they defeated then they were the Caesarians. They defeated the second round after Brutus and Cassius were gone. And they would fall out for a third round that would end with the defeat and death of Mark Antony in Egypt. But Cicero found himself in that process on the wrong side. And Octavian claimed later, I spent 2 days trying to convince Mark Antony not to kill him, but they cut his head off. And they cut his hands off, nailed him to the rostra, and I think Antony's wife went in with her hairpin and stabbed his tongue in a very famous. And they rotted out on the forum. They'd never done that. I mean, not since Sulla had they done that.
We talked a little bit about this in the first session of this 3-part series, how these ancient republics served both as examples for what to replicate, but also to avoid. And this particular scenario, even as Cicero was followed in many ways by the founders from a philosophical perspective, just in the story that you outline here about his demise, it also highlights the violence that can be, the political violence that can be present in republics as well.
Well, it's a good point, because while we're talking about the influence of classics on the founding that was very profound, we're really talking about a quartet of Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, and Adams. But there was people like Benjamin Rush that resented this, and some of the arguments that they made was it was easier in the Greek context, because they said we're not a military oligarchy like Sparta, and we're not an out of control demagogic democracy like Athens. And even if we were thinking that was an example, it failed. There was 1,500 city-states of different calibrations of government. They were consensual, yes, they did not have kings in Greece proper, but they fought all the time, and they never had a god. And then we look at the corrective to that, the Roman Constitution, which Polybius reminds us was why it was so effective. And that's a good model to adopt in certain fashions, but don't kid yourself. They destroyed their republic by civil wars and demagoguery and sedition and insurrection. And then they went into an autocratic imperial period. So we want to pick and choose things from this, but don't think that we're going to emulate them because they didn't have the solution like we did. And the longer the new republic lasted, at least up until the Civil War, without a serious insurrection, and there was general stability. No president tried to stay too long or hijack. They increasingly got more and more confident and said, we found a solution to the pathologies of the ancient world. Another thing that was very important was they rejected the Rousseauian. They were very impressed, especially Jefferson, by Rousseau and the idea that we're born into the world in chains, that we're a natural, wonderful person, but our family, the government, religion warps us. And that was contrary to the classical natural law of Cicero and others that said we're born innately, we know right from wrong, and we have to have civilization to help this natural law emerge. Why do we know that stealing's wrong? Why do we know that murder's wrong? Even the criminal from the moment he's born knows that. Why, when he wrote a treatise called the Proarchia, why do we all have a desire innate in us to read about literature or history or listen to music? So Cicero was a valuable tool for the founders to reject the French model. And then a decade later, when you had the French Revolution, and people saw, you had what was supposed to be a peaceful replacement of the Bourbons by a constitutional monarchy, and then you had you had Danton, and then suddenly you had the Robespierre brothers, the Reign of Terror, the guillotine, then you had the Thermidor reaction, and then you had the directorate, and then you had the consulship, and then you ended up with Napoleon. And they said, you know what? They took the wrong lessons from antiquity, and the French philosophers were of no value with their idea of a therapeutic view of human nature.
Well, once again, Victor, you've set up a perfect transition to where I wanted to go next, which was, one of the reasons that we've organized this three-part discussion is to, first make the argument that the American founding, as we approach the 250th anniversary of the country next year, is sometimes seen as a miracle in Philadelphia, that it kind of came sui generis within a very short period of time. But the reality is that there were these precedents set and philosophies discussed and examples seen from history, even going back 2,000 years. The other aspect of this, which I think is important, is that there were other philosophers, there were other political philosophers much more recent. I'm talking now about the pre-Enlightenment and Enlightenment that were making arguments about the importance of a republic or a free government or an anti-monarchical system that the founders were also arguing against, the American founders. And in some ways, the founders were not only going back to these ancient philosophers and historians and statesmen, not only to argue for what they were developing, but they were also arguing against some of these other more recent philosophers, specifically folks like Hobbes and Machiavelli, and as you say, Rousseau. So there were many different arguments going on philosophically that led directly to the American founding. And one, I just wanted to follow on this important point you made, especially about the importance of Rousseau, who argued in many ways that all of the institutions that the ancients saw as important were actually shackles that were deforming mechanisms, that Rousseau would argue that we need to be free of family, we need to be free of government, we need to be free of tradition. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to come back to another quote, again from John Zvesper from one of the readings, which again, to those who are watching, these will all be linked in the YouTube description here if you'd like to follow along. And this is John Zvesper. He said, quote, "It is useful to dwell on the fundamental thesis shared by the founders and the classics, that humans are by nature political animals who engage in political conflict with winners and losers, but who need to do so under philosophical moderation." So again, there were some very timely arguments happening at the time of the founding with folks like Rousseau and others who were saying that really we needed to be free of these order-making institutions, that we were by nature, that there was a state of nature in which we were solitary. But the founders in many ways, and certainly going back to the ancients, made the argument that we really needed to create these institutions and support others as virtue forming. Talk a bit about this argument between these more recent philosophers like Rousseau and how the ancients were understanding
Well, the founders looked at these two deviant views of what I would say Aristotelian or Ciceronian approval of, or chauvinism, or arguments for a constitutional system. When Aristotle says "Phuse anthropos zoon politikon," by nature, man is a political animal. He's not talking about politics like we do. He's saying the polis, city-state. You could translate it more literally in English. Man is by nature a city-state animal, meaning he wants to live in a community where the question of how to govern is up for grabs. He does not, by nature, want to be a slave or a serf or subservient. He wants to be a free person who is self-governing. And that's what and then he, in the fourth and fifth, sixth books of politics, he outlines that, and he has a lot of choices. And I'll show you 4 types of deviant oligarchy and deviant democracy. And then he came and offered the ideal city-state, and it was very close to what the founders agreed with. It was an agrarian type of democracy. He called it politeia, constitutionalism, in which people would be busy on the farms. They would be imbued with agrarian values. They would not be corrupt. This is very influential on Jefferson, who said, once we get piled up in the cities, we're going to lose the republic. And they would be working, they would combine mind with body, they would come in rarely, but on schedule to engage in politics, and then they would go back to their farms, and they would be not subject to the corrupting influence of a city. And it took the opposite kind of, in Latin, the word, we get our urbane from urbanus, and we get rustic from rus, country. So really, and the same thing is true of the Greek vocabulary. Agrikos means rustic. In other words, the city vocabulary, or the philosophers said people that came in from the countryside were backward, and rustic became a negative pejorative word, but not for Aristotle. And the founders were very influenced. They deliberately avoided this therapeutic view of Rousseau, but they also, Hobbes and Machiavelli had talked about consensual government, and they had certain takes on it, given their knowledge of Athens. And one was they needed a Leviathan, or they needed a strong sort of like a Pericles. They felt that that great age of 459 to 429, that 30 years, the great 30 years of Athens, in theory, as Thucydides says, it worked as a democracy, but in fact, it was ruled by first citizen, meaning they continually elected Pericles the ruling archon. There were no term limitations. And he ruled out with an iron fist. And Thucydides says when the democracy started to get too radical, he, like a horse whip, pulled them in. And when they got complacent and they were unimaginative and they didn't have he spurred them on. And so, but that model was sort of behind the Hobbesian idea of, bellum omnia, omnium contra omnes. Life is a war of everybody against everybody else.
All against all.
You need a strong central executive. Machiavelli was actually, he believed in the Florentine and Venetian republics, but his attitude was similar in a way that, that certain Caesar Borgia and certain strong men were needed, and they had to use certain skills of lying, deceit, conspiracies to control this mob that otherwise was in a consensual government but would not be able to function without guidance. And so when the founders looked at that, they took the pessimistic view seriously of the population, but they didn't take the corrective that they offered. And they said, we're going to create a republic of virtue, more along Cicero talked of virtue. You can have the perfect political system, but you have to have virtue. And then, people like Hamilton and Adams and others said we wouldn't need a lot of the amendments, and we wouldn't need these separation of powers and checks and balance if man was an angel.
Right.
But we assume that he's basically a devil.
Right.
So we have to protect him from himself with these things. So it was that they were very influenced by Cicero, and Cicero, although he modeled his dialogues after Plato, a lot of his constitutionalism came from Aristotle.
This leads to another point, which I think is worth reflecting on as it relates to the ancients and their discussion of at least the foundations of natural law. One of the elements of natural law is that everything has a purpose. There is a teleology. And as it relates to government or setting up governing systems for people, that each of us as human beings have a teleology as well, that we have a purpose. One of the most famous phrases of the Declaration of Independence is the pursuit of happiness. And classically understood, happiness is actually another way of saying purpose, that it's a way of understanding, whether it's the Christian God or the Greek or pagan gods, that we were created for a reason, and governments were constituted for that reason. I wondered if you could speak about the importance of that in balancing against, say, a Hobbes, who was very much a very popular philosopher at the time of the American founding, but that kind of war of all against all. But the founders referring back to this natural law foundation, that governments were actually constituted, albeit dealing with a human nature that's fallen, but that we as individuals actually have some purpose that governed effectively and freely, that we are free to pursue that purpose.
Yeah, all men are born equal in the Declaration. So they adopted for, it's kind of contrary or paradoxical, because when you say they have a pessimistic view, and they did, that humans are, the way that you can resolve that paradox or apparent contradiction is if you, I think, take them at their own words in the Federalist and letters and things, and the Constitution itself. and they believe that people are capable of anything because they're born as fallen creatures. But when you say fallen, that doesn't mean they didn't know what they're doing. They know they're sinning. They know they're doing wrong. So to create and promote virtue, you have to create a political system that allows people to express themselves, but at the same time, and to explore these innate natural tendencies that all men are born equal. All men want to be free. All people want free speech. All people innately feel there's a divinity. But you have to create a system where the strong and the fallen don't oppress the weaker. And that you have to assume that there's always going to be people in a free society that will try to destroy the Senate or try to turn the presidency into a monarchy or try to go after political enemies or use the court system. And so you try to make a structure that allows the good, the innate good, to be protected from the few who have rejected their innate good. And that's what the whole Constitution's about. It's not built to be that's why we're the only country in the world that's ever really been able to pull it off. Every other system is a parliamentary system and kind of an Athenian system. When you're a prime minister and you think you're going to lose your coalition, then you dissolve the government. Or you can be elected by people in Britain, to take one example, and then all of a sudden your party can meet in a back room and say, I think he's going to lose the next election. Margaret Thatcher's out, even though she was elected. We would never even comprehend that or tolerate that. But on the other hand, this idea of we're going to have every 4 years a set period, no matter who is in charge. And we're going to basically the system will encourage two political parties, not all these fragmentary parties. And in addition to that, the popular vote is not going to determine the president. It's going to be the Electoral College. And that's going to force people to go into rural areas. And there's all these arguments that we forget now about the Electoral College. And when we tried to nation build and go around the world in the 19th and 20th century and implant systems, even in Iraq and Afghanistan, nobody said we're going to use our system. They said we better just use the parliamentary system. It's the easiest, it's the simplest, and it doesn't require the population to be schooled on certain things about the use of the Supreme Court or the lower courts or the Electoral College or scheduled elections, midterm elections, all this stuff.
Well, that actually takes us to the last question I'd like to ask, Victor, which is this idea of equality and the revolutionary nature of it, to obviously borrow a phrase from the founding, a word from the founding. And again, I wanted to quote back Zvesper on this note and the connection between human equality and the ancients' views of human nature. And by then reference, the understanding of the founders, who were just so grounded in this ancient understanding, also certainly a Christian understanding of human nature. Zvesper writes this: the idea of human equality is clearly central in a very significant sense to classical political philosophy, because that philosophy depends on an idea of a common human nature, unquote. Now, at least the Greeks and Spartans, if not the Romans themselves, were not known for their practice of human equality, certainly on the scale that the American founders did. But relative to previous periods and following periods, there was this connection between human equality, our creation as human beings, and a common human nature. The French, as you said, took a very different path on that when it came to the French Revolution. But talk a bit about how the American founders understood the importance of that view of human equality and how it connected to how the Greeks and Romans and Spartans practiced.
They had looked at the classical period, and the problem with equality was that it was mandated. And so 1,000 square miles in ancient Attica, the countryside around the Athens, you can't find a farm mentioned in epigraphic writing or literature or archaeologically that was larger than 100 acres. And when they started a new colony, we can see aerial photography of the parsonage. It was equal. And then Plato has all of these discussions, as does Aristotle. Yes, it works well when you have the largest middle class. But the problem with that is that we're not born equally. So there's always going to be someone who's smarter, healthier, luckier, and they're going to have a natural, innate idea to express themselves by consolidation. And if we restrict that, then we're sort of tampering down bright people who might enrich the society. But if we encourage that, then we're not going to have a vibrant middle class. So that was the philosophical dilemma from the very beginning. And when the founders looked at that, I think you could say their ethos was, their vision was a nation of yeoman agrarians. That was clear. And they also realized, though, that you did not want a mandated equality. That was something Europe, in the French Revolution, as you said, that was the lesson that they took from antiquity. But Tocqueville, who 1832 or so looked at this system, and he said they've kind of solved the problem in some ways. They don't have a serfdom like Russia. They do not have an oppressed peasantry, but they have viable middle class people who are autonomous both politically, and they use this word autarkic. They are economically self-sufficient. And he says something, Tocqueville says about the problem that all consensual societies have is most people would rather be equal and all poor than unequal and better off.
Right.
And what he was saying is that when you allow captains of industry, saying that you can make the argument that Carnegie or Rockefeller or the Mellons or Guggenheims or later Ford, they did so, or the Silicon Valley zillionaires. When you unleash them, and what the left calls trickle down, the standard of living for everybody increases. But the natural innate tendency is envy.
Right.
And they will try, as Mondami is doing, they will try to create laws, regulations, zoning to take those people. And that's why we had the revolt, to use a modern example, of the tech barons in the 2024 going from hard left to right. And they were saying, this has gone too far. They're picking winners and losers and artificial. And that was something that the founders were very careful about, because there is nothing in the Constitution about suppressing wealth, guaranteeing a certain level of taxation, confiscation. In fact, it's just the opposite, that you have rights to protect search and seizure, and that applies to the wealthy as well. So it was the idea that we're going to make a structure and it's going to be kind of a free-for-all. But the system will be self-correcting because the legislature can make laws, and if they try to create a communism, the president can veto them. And if they try to make an oligarchy, the president can veto. Or if the president wants to do that, we don't have to pass the laws, or we can filibuster. That's not in the Constitution, but that was soon after. And if they can't get along, and one side's favoring oligarchy and the other one is favoring anarchy, then the Supreme Court can come in. And the Supreme Court can be checked in term by the judges have to be nominated and approved by 2/3 at that time of the Senate. So the system was designed to allow free enterprise and free market economics. And if people felt at certain times that there was a consolidation of wealth, then you had a Teddy Roosevelt or a Franklin Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson that could come for a period. And if they went too far, you could have an Eisenhower later.
Coolidge and so forth.
It was a self-correcting, but the subtext of it was we want to be the most powerful nation in the world, and we want to be the wealthiest, and we have manifest destiny, and we're going to be so wealthy and so stable that even the poor people will flock and want to be part of this because they'll be better off than in Europe. And it's hard to criticize the result, because if you look at today, American GDP is about the size of the entire European continent of 500 million people.
Right.
And when you look at the NATO alliance, it cannot sneeze without the United States. And when you look at AI or genetic engineering or cryptocurrency or robotics, it's basically the United States is reasserting its dominance, and that's because of the system.
Right.
And the traditions that grew up around the system. I mean, we don't flirt with French revolutionary principles. Every time we want to change the foundational date to 1619, kind of a year zero like the French Revolution, or we change names of buildings, or we tear down statues in an iconoclastic fashion, we stop and we have a counter-revolution, as we're seeing now. The French, they renamed the days of the week, the days of the month, the foundational date. They basically, in the French Revolution, wiped out a large part of the church. And then they had an overcorrection with Napoleon. But we've been able to avoid that. We don't have a First Republic, Second Republic, Third Republic, Fourth Republic. And the one time that we did in the Civil War, as Lincoln saw, that the nation could not live half free and half slave, and they were in a dilemma because they had never anticipated the founders. They had elaborate rules and regulations how to become a state, but never in their right mind did they have any idea of succession. So in the Constitution, there was never any idea of how you get out of it. Can you get out of it? Or if you get out of it, are you an outlaw? Well, the South came along and says, we got out of it. And Lincoln came up with slavery was the problem.
Right.
Because they weren't going to give up slavery, and that was contrary to all men are born equal.
Right.
Of the Declaration. So Lincoln kind of came up with the idea. He came up with them. He saw the fallacies of the Confederacy. He said, wait. We are so intertwined. You have a federal post office in Alabama. You have a federal armory in Texas. You have Fort Sumner off the coast of South Carolina. It's now under federal jurisdiction with federal troops.
Right.
And he solved that problem and said, you cannot create state and local laws that confiscate federal property. And if you want to succeed, you can, but we're going to go down there and protect our federal property. That's been it's very timely, because as we're speaking, there's 600 so-called sanctuary cities of independent jurisdiction. And you can see what's happening. And we've got to be very careful to look at the Constitution and look at our history, look at the nullification movement. They have Roman precedents and Greek precedents, and then look at what caused the Civil War. So when, let's say, ICE is going into a state jurisdiction to deport someone, they claim, and I think most of them in the first round are criminal or have previous deportation. And Nancy Pelosi says, we're going to arrest ICE, or the Chicago mayor or the Illinois governor said, we're going to prevent them from doing this. And the matter is that federal law and federal property, you cannot, does she understand that if you have a California highway patrolman and he said, or a San Francisco County sheriff, and he goes over to a federal ICE officer and says, I don't like the way you're enforcing federal law. It contravenes state law, and I don't think that you can operate out of this compound in San Francisco, even though it's federal. Well, they're both armed, so what's going to happen? Are we getting to that point? And are we getting to the point where Donald Trump said, if you're going to do that to ICE, I'm just going to stop all admissions to Yosemite. You can't go. That's our property. And that was really a problem with the founders. So they tried their best. They said, the 10th Amendment, anything that's not exactly prescribed by the Constitution is left to the states. That's a city-state model. Anything that's written down, that's the Roman model. And it supersedes the state. And then, as I think we talked earlier, Article 6 has that famous supremacy clause. It says when the federal government is doing tariffs or treaties or federal legislation, its officers are supreme over state and local. And we've had problems. I mean, George Wallace or Orville Faubus or Southern governors during the civil rights movement in Arkansas, Mississippi, Ross Barnett, Alabama, they said, no, we have a unique culture here in Alabama. You don't understand it. It grew up, and we believe in the separations of the races and the superior, and you can't come in here. And Eisenhower and later Kennedy, no. We've already been through this with the Civil War.
Right.
And we have the right to nationalize your guard because you are defying a Supreme Court ruling or a federal law. So it's getting, it's kind of ironic that the left today is taking the states' rights position. And they are saying, no, people in San Francisco or Portland or Seattle or Washington or Minnesota, they are morally superior to the people now in charge of Washington. So they have the moral right to push back. And you can't do that because it's selective. If some county in Utah says, I agree, and we don't want the three-spotted lizard on the endangered species list to stop our building, we're just going to crush the SOB. Or you know what, we're a county in Mississippi, and federal gun registration, it's stupid. If you want to come to a county in Mississippi and buy a Glock, just come up and get it off the shelf and pay for it. And the left would say, no, that is states' rightism, and you're trying to nullify a federal law. And that came up during the city-states when they started to have hegemonic leagues. The Theban Confederation, what is Thespiae, or what is Thisbe's relationship with the Federation? And so the founders they had these articles in the Bill of Rights. They were very worried about that.
Well, Victor, I think on that note, we'll conclude this session. But again, just the importance of understanding the ancients and their relevance not only to the founding, but you've just outlined even to current events, especially as they relate to issues of federalism. So important to understand that. This will conclude the second session of the 3 sessions in this What the Ancients Taught the Founders. Again, all of the readings for all of these 3 sessions will be in the YouTube program description, so feel free to click on those links and follow along, and stay tuned for our 3rd and final session in this What the Ancients Taught the Founders series. Thanks so much for joining us.